She had pulled shrapnel out of a man's throat with her bare hands in a forward operating base outside Kandahar while the ceiling was literally on fire. She had done chest compressions for 41 minutes on a 19-year-old kid whose name she still couldn't forget. She had walked away from the army with a duffel bag, a shoulder that clicked when it rained, and a discharge paper that said honorable in a font that felt too small for everything it represented. And now the hospital administrator was telling her she didn't understand pressure. "Rachel, I need you to think about how this looks," Dr. Harlan Voss said, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead like he was too important to actually use them. "You countermanded a senior physician's order in front of 3 residents and a patient's family." "The senior physician was wrong," Rachel said. "The patient had a tension pneumothorax. Another 4 minutes and she would have arrested." "That's not the—" "She would have died, Dr. Voss." He set down his pen, folded his hands, gave her the look she had seen from men like him her entire career. The particular arrangement of features that meant you are technically correct, and I am going to punish you for it anyway. You're a talented nurse, Rachel. Nobody disputes that. But this hospital has a chain of command, and you spent 6 years in the actual chain of command, she said. I know what it's for. I also know when it's being used wrong. The silence between them was the kind that had weight. Take the rest of the week, Voss finally said. We'll revisit your scheduling when things cool down. Translation, go home, think about what you've done, come back smaller. Rachel picked up her badge from his desk. She'd set it down out of habit when she walked in, a reflex from army briefings where you surrendered your ID at the door, and clipped it back to her scrub pocket. It's Tuesday, she said. I'm aware. She left without another word because she'd learned a long time ago that some arguments you win by walking away and some you lose by staying. That had been 3 hours ago. Now it was nearly midnight, and Redwood Memorial Hospital was doing what coastal hospitals did during a November storm, absorbing chaos one ambulance at a time. Rachel was back on the floor because Voss's rest of the week had lasted exactly as long as it took the charge nurse to call her and say they were short 3 staff and the storm wasn't letting up. She hadn't even hesitated. That was the thing about her that people like Voss never quite understood. She didn't show up for the politics. She showed up for the work. The ER was loud in that specific way that had nothing to do with volume. It was the frequency of it. Monitors, wheels on linoleum, a child crying somewhere behind curtain 4, someone on a radio saying ETA 6 minutes in a voice that meant the next 6 minutes mattered. Rachel moved through it like water finding its level. She checked the chest pain in Bay 2, redirected a confused orderly with the IV supplies, caught a medication error on the board before it went anywhere, and was halfway through updating a chart when the automatic doors blew open. Not from a patient. From the storm itself, or so it seemed. A gust that sent paper cups skidding across the waiting room floor and made the fluorescent lights flicker once, twice, then hold. And through that door came the dog. He was enormous. A German shepherd, maybe 90 pounds, coat soaked flat against his ribs, moving with the careful deliberateness of an animal that had been through something and was still going through it. No collar visible under the wet fur. No handler behind him. He paused just inside the entrance, let the doors close, and shook once, a full-body shudder that sent a spray of rainwater across the nearest row of plastic chairs. The waiting room went strange, not panicked, just still. The way things go still when something instinctively registers as significant before the brain has caught up. The dog surveyed the room, methodical, patient. His eyes moved across faces the way a soldier checks corners, and Rachel watched him from 15 feet away with her chart still in her hands and felt the back of her neck do something it hadn't done since she was overseas. That specific prickle, situational awareness sharpening without permission. The dog looked at her. She'd been looked at by animals before. This was different. This wasn't the unfocused curiosity of a scared stray. This was recognition, or something so close to it that the distinction stopped mattering. He held her gaze for a full 3 seconds, then walked toward her with the kind of certainty that made the 2 security guards near the desk step back without quite realizing they were doing it. He stopped 2 feet away and sat. Rachel slowly crouched, chart set aside, and held out the back of her hand. Easy, boy, easy. Her voice was the one she used when things were bad and calm was the only tool left. The dog sniffed her hand, then pressed his head briefly against her palm. Not a nuzzle, not a request for affection, something else. A confirmation. "Where did you come from?" she said quietly. From somewhere behind her, she heard a sharp intake of breath, then a voice, male, low. "That's not possible." She turned. Near the far wall, half obscured by the corner of the triage desk, stood 4 men. They hadn't been there a minute ago, or she hadn't registered them, which with her was almost the same thing. They were dressed civilian, which meant they were trying to look civilian, which with their posture and their eyes and the particular stillness of men who had trained the fidget out of themselves years ago, was not entirely succeeding. One of them, mid-30s, a pale scar running from his jaw to the hinge of his ear, was staring at the dog with an expression Rachel could only describe as grief wearing the mask of shock. "That dog," he said, barely above a whisper, "was declared K1A 3 years ago." The dog didn't look at him. The dog was still looking at Rachel. Her name was Rachel Hayes. 31 years old, 5'6", brown hair usually in a braid by hour 2 of any shift, left shoulder that clicked in cold weather and had since 2019. She held a BSN from a state school in Virginia and had completed her nursing degree while still technically in the reserves, which most of her colleagues at Redwood Memorial did not know, and which she did not advertise. Before the BSN, there had been 6 years of Army service, 6 8W, combat medic, 2 deployments, one of which had been the kind that didn't show up on the polished version of her record. She had come back to Oregon 3 years ago because her mother was here, and then her mother got better. And then Rachel had stayed anyway because she didn't have a more specific reason to go anywhere else, and that was as much intention as most of her life choices had ever contained. She was good at her job in the way that people who have done harder versions of the same job elsewhere are always good at the easier version. Not effortlessly, but with a kind of bedrock competence that didn't require performance. She didn't need people to see it. She just needed it to be true. Voss saw a nurse who didn't respect hierarchy. What Voss didn't see was that she did respect hierarchy. She just also knew what it looked like when hierarchy was being used as a substitute for judgment. She had never quite figured out how to explain that distinction to people who hadn't earned it through something real. She was thinking about this, or more precisely, she was not thinking about it in the way she not thought about a lot of things while her hands did the actual work of nursing. When she started working her fingers carefully through the dog's fur, checking for injuries, which was the right thing to do regardless of anything else happening in this room. He was thin under the wet coat, not starved, but worked down, like he'd been running on reserves. There was an old healed laceration along his left flank that had closed without stitches. Scar tissue, maybe 2 years old. His paws were calloused in a way that suggested rough terrain and long distances, not suburban sidewalks. She found the tag on the 3rd pass. Not a collar tag. A military identification marker, the kind that gets zip-tied to equipment in the field because you want it attached to something that won't come off. Rusted. The kind of rust that comes from salt water, not time alone. She held it under the fluorescent light. K9 Unit Bravo 7. Handler, Captain M. Drake, 11th SFG. She read it twice. Then she stood up and turned to the 4 men by the wall. "Which one of you is going to tell me who Mason Drake is?" The one with the scar looked at her differently now. Not dismissal. She was used to that, and this wasn't it. Something more complicated. Assessment. "Who are you?" he said. "Rachel Hayes. I'm the nurse this dog just walked up to instead of anyone else in this building. So I'm going to ask you again because the tag says he belongs to a captain in the 11th Special Forces Group, and Special Forces assets don't go missing without a record, and that record says this animal is dead. And he is clearly not dead, so somebody in this room needs to start talking." The 4 men exchanged a look she recognized, the kind of look shared between people who are trying to figure out how much they can say, which meant there was considerably more they weren't saying. The Scar one pulled something from his jacket pocket, a laminated ID that he held at the edge of his fingers, facing her, long enough for her to read it and no longer. Captain's rank. Defense Intelligence. His name was Sorrell. Garrett Sorrell. Captain Drake, Sorrel said, in the careful tone of someone choosing every word like it might detonate, was listed as killed in action during an op 18 months ago. The dog was declared lost with the unit 38 months ago. 2 different timelines, 2 different incidents. He paused. Both classified. Rachel looked at the tag again, then at the dog. He was watching Sorrel now, not with aggression, but with the alert stillness of an animal that knew this man and had decided not to approach him, which told her something. "He doesn't like you," she said. "He doesn't know me," Sorrel said. "I wasn't part of his unit." Animals read something more than familiarity. She handed him the tag. "You need to run this, tonight." "Ma'am, I spent 6 years as a 68W in the Army. I have been in rooms where the paperwork said one thing and the body said another, and I know what the distance between those 2 things looks like. This dog is not lost. He came here on purpose, in a specific direction, to a specific person. Me? I don't know why. And he is carrying a tag for a man your records say is dead." She met his eyes. "So whatever you have in motion, you need to move it faster." The storm hit the windows like it was trying to get inside. Sorrel put the tag in his pocket. He pulled out a phone and stepped away from the group, and Rachel watched the other 3 men shift their posture almost imperceptibly. Closing ranks, she thought, or organizing. One of them moved to stand nearer the dog, who glanced at him and then back at Rachel, still anchored on her. She went back to the dog and began a more careful assessment. Not just for injuries now, for anything. He was trained, clearly. The way he held still under her hands was not the compliance of an obedient pet, but the discipline of a working animal, different in texture, different in quality. She ran her fingers along his collar area again and felt something she'd missed the first time. Not under the fur, in it. Braided into the fur at the back of his neck, dry because it was on the underside and the rain hadn't reached it, was a thin strip of what felt like fabric. She worked it free carefully. It was approximately 2 inches of dark green webbing with a sequence of numbers written on it in what looked like a permanent marker, the kind soldiers used to mark their gear. The numbers were worn but legible. 17.34 north /128.09 west. Bravo, still active. MD coordinates. Rachel stared at the strip of webbing for a moment. Then she stood, walked to the triage desk, and pulled up a coastal navigation chart on the workstation she technically wasn't supposed to use for non-clinical purposes. She typed in the coordinates. The pin dropped on a small island 11 miles offshore. No listed inhabitants. No registered structures. The island didn't have a name in the database. It had a designation. Decommissioned. Restricted access. Do not approach. Dr. Voss arrived at 20 past midnight, which meant someone had called him, which meant the situation had already left the category of unusual ER incident and entered something else. He came through the staff entrance and stopped when he saw the 4 men, the dog, and Rachel standing in the middle of his ER with the kind of posture that meant she had already decided what came next and was waiting for the building to catch up. "Rachel," he said, "what in the—" "We need this bay locked down," she said. Not to Voss, to Sorrel, who was off his phone now. "Whoever you have in the area, you need them here." "We have assets 40 minutes out," Sorrel said. "Make it 25. She turned to the charge nurse, a veteran of 20 years named Dolores, who had seen enough to know when to follow and when to ask. "Dolores, I need Bay 6 cleared and sealed. Nobody in or out without my say-so." Dolores looked at the men, looked at the dog, looked at Rachel. "Done," she said, and moved. Voss stepped closer. "Now wait a minute," he said, low and sharp. "You don't have the authority to— "She does tonight," Sorrel said without looking at Voss. His attention was on his phone again, thumb moving fast across the screen. Voss made a noise. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" Sorrel held up the laminated ID. Voss went quiet. Not the insulted quiet of a moment ago. A different kind. The quiet of a man recalibrating how much he understood about the last 5 minutes. Rachel was not looking at Voss. She was watching the dog, who had stood when she moved and was now pacing a small arc near the Bay 6 entrance in a pattern she recognized. She had seen working dogs in the field enough times to know what that movement meant. He was telling her something. He had been telling her since he walked through the door. The coordinates were one message. This was another. "What is it?" she said, crouching again. "What are you trying to show me?" The dog stopped pacing. He sat. He looked at the exit that led to the parking structure and then back at her. "He wants to lead," one of the other men said. The youngest of the four, a lean kid with a Tennessee accent who hadn't spoken until now. "That's a guide behavior. He wants to take someone somewhere." "Somewhere specific," Rachel said. "He knows the route." She looked at the coordinates still pulled up on the workstation screen. 11 miles offshore. An island with no name and a do not approach designation and a strip of green webbing that said Bravo still active in the handwriting of a man officially recorded as dead. Sorrel came back to the group. His face had done something. Tightened, she thought, or maybe settled. The face of a man who had just gotten confirmation of something he had hoped wasn't true. "Command verified the tag," he said. "The K-9's name is Ridgeline. He was assigned to Drake's unit during Operation Harrow. The op was discontinued, that's the official language, approximately 38 months ago. Drake was listed K-1A 18 months after that during a separate classified tasking." He stopped. "Command is also confirming that those coordinates are not in their active operational database." "But they were once," Rachel said. "Yeah." He looked at the dog. "They were once." The storm shook the building with something that felt personal. Somewhere outside, a transformer went, and the ER switched to backup power. Spikes. Same light, slightly different hum. The sound of the hospital holding its breath. Dolores appeared at the Bay 6 entrance. "It's cleared," she said. Rachel stood. She looked at Sorrel. "You said 40 minutes." 28 now, he said. "Then we have 28 minutes to figure out what we're doing with the rest of the night." She looked at Ridgeline, who was still watching the exit. Patient. Certain, the way she had seen men wait in the army when they were waiting for permission to do the thing they'd already decided had to be done. Because that dog didn't come 11 miles through a storm to sit in a hospital bay. He came to bring someone back out there. She looked at the coordinates on the screen. An island with no name. A dead man's handwriting. The word active, which in military language meant exactly what it sounded like. Sorrel followed her gaze and said nothing for a moment, then, "You're a nurse." "I'm a 68W with 2 combat deployments, a nursing degree, and the only read on that dog's behavior anyone in this room has given him since he walked through the door," Rachel said. "You can spend the next 27 minutes telling me I'm a civilian, or you can use them better." Sorrel looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was also a calculation. Ridgeline stood again, looked at the door, looked at Rachel. Outside, something in the storm changed pitch. The wind dropping half a register, the rain hitting the windows differently, the particular shift that coastal people learn to read as a weather system moving its weight around before settling in for the long version of itself. In 48 hours, Rachel Hayes would be in a boat in the dark, in a storm, moving toward a dot on a map that wasn't supposed to exist. In 48 hours, she would meet a man whose death she was currently holding in her hands on a strip of green webbing. In 48 hours, a chain of events would begin moving that would unravel 3 years of deliberate silence, expose 7 men to federal criminal liability, and rewrite the official record of a mission that the Army had quietly decided to forget. But right now, it was 12:34 in the morning, and Ridgeline was watching the door, and somewhere out in the black water off the Oregon coast, something that was supposed to be dead was still breathing. Sorrel's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something shifted in his posture. Not alarm, worse than alarm. The kind of stillness that comes right before everything accelerates. "That's command," he said, and picked up. Rachel watched his face as he listened. She had learned to read people in the field, not psychology, not intuition exactly, just the accumulated data of watching men receive bad news in real time until she could identify it the way she identified rhythms on a monitor. The slight jaw tightened. The eyes that stop blinking while the brain catches up. When he lowered the phone, she was ready. "There's a signal," he said. "Automated distress beacon. Bearing 11 miles offshore, matching the coordinates." His voice was flat in the way that meant he was working to keep it flat. It's been transmitting for 6 hours. We don't know why our systems didn't pick it up earlier. He didn't say, or we do know why, and that's worse. But she heard it anyway. Someone suppressed it, Rachel said. Sorrel didn't answer, which was its own answer. Ridgeline turned from the exit and looked at Rachel, and in his eyes was something that should not have been possible in an animal. The quiet, tired certainty of someone who had been waiting a very long time to hand something to the right person and had finally found her. Rachel reached into her scrub pocket. Her fingers closed around the strip of green webbing. Bravo still active. MD. She looked at Sorrel. Tell your assets to hurry, she said. The assets arrived in 22 minutes, not 28, which told Rachel that whatever Sorrel had said on that phone call had moved something upstream faster than standard protocol allowed. They came in 2 vehicles, unmarked Pacific Northwest plates, the kind of fleet gray that wasn't trying to blend in so much as simply not announce itself. 6 men total. 4 in tactical gear worn under civilian jackets. The compromise of people who needed to move through a hospital without triggering a lockdown. 2 in what Rachel recognized as the specific brand of nondescript that federal investigators cultivated the way some people cultivated hobbies. Everything slightly too coordinated, slightly too pressed for the middle of the night. Sorrel met them at the staff entrance. There was a conversation Rachel was not part of, involving a lot of very quiet talking, and at least one moment where the older of the 2 federal types looked over Sorrel's shoulder directly at her and said nothing, which she had long ago learned to interpret as the loudest possible statement. Ridgeline stayed at her side. He had not moved from her side since the bay's 6th door closed. One of the tactical men had tried to take his lead, or would have if Ridgeline had been wearing one. And the dog had simply stepped closer to Rachel and looked at the man with the patient expression of someone who does not need to raise their voice to make a point. The man stepped back. Ridgeline sat. He's not going to let you hand him off, Rachel told Sorrel when he came back. Yeah, I got that. He scrubbed a hand over the back of his neck. Listen, the beacon signal has been analyzed. It's not automated. Someone is triggering it manually. Interval pattern. 3 short, pause, 2 long pause, repeat. That's not a malfunction. Rachel knew Morse well enough to work it out in her head, S&I, or a fragment of something longer. It could be an identifier, she said. That's what our signals people think. He paused. Drake's identifier in the field was Sierra India, unit shorthand. His team used it when they couldn't risk voice. The room got heavier somehow. Not noisier, the opposite. The kind of quiet that settles when something you suspected becomes something you know. He's alive, Rachel said. Not a question. The signal is alive, Sorrel said carefully. We're not assuming beyond that. But his jaw was doing the tight thing again, and she knew he was already beyond that, had been since the phone call, and was just managing what he let himself say out loud. One of the federal men, he'd given his name as Dre, just the one name, which was either a last name or a call sign, and she didn't ask, came to stand with them. He had the unhurried quality of someone used to situations where urgency had to be expressed internally, because expressing it externally cost you clarity. Ms. Hayes, he said, Captain Sorrel tells me you identified the coordinates and the behavioral indicators on the K9 before any of his people did. I grew up around working dogs, and I spent 6 years patching up the people they worked with, Rachel said. Neither of those things makes me special. They just make me familiar. Fair. Dre looked at Ridgeline. You understand that what we're moving toward is a classified operational situation. Whatever you've already seen tonight, I'm not interested in classified information for its own sake, Rachel said. I'm interested in whether someone is alive on that island and whether the people going out there are going to need medical support. She looked at him steadily. Are they? Dre glanced at Sorrel. Something passed between them, the kind of bilateral agreement that happens too fast for language. The island has no confirmed structures in our current intelligence, Dre said. 18 months old. Whatever's there now, we don't know. If there are survivors, yes, we'll need medical. Then stop explaining my clearance concerns to me and let's figure out the boat situation, Rachel said. The boat situation was not simple. The coast was 40 minutes from the hospital by car, and the storm had not decided to cooperate with anyone's timeline. A harbor master named Pollock, 60s, permanently sun-damaged, the posture of a man who had stopped being surprised by things that happened at night a long time ago, met them at the dock with a look on his face that said he had been woken by a federal phone call and was reserving judgment about how he felt about that. 12-foot swells, he said, not to anyone in particular. Winds at 32 knots and climbing. I can get you the Harrow Point tender. She's a 42-foot response vessel, twin diesel. She'll handle it. But I want it on record that I told you the conditions. Noted, Dre said. Recorded, Pollock said, and meant it differently. Rachel had been on water in bad conditions twice in her life. Once during a training exercise that she did not count because the instructors could always call it off. Once during a relief operation off the coast of a country she was not allowed to name in casual conversation, where the water had been warmer but no calmer, and she had spent 40 minutes holding a pressure dressing on a sailor's leg while the deck moved under her like it was alive and trying to throw her off. She had not loved either experience. She was not planning to love this one. She was going anyway. Ridgeline boarded without hesitation. He found a spot near the forward cabin, braced his legs, and watched the water. His tail was still. His ears were forward. He looked like he had done this before, which he probably had, and which settled something in Rachel's chest that she didn't examine too closely because the boat was starting to move and she needed to be useful. Sorrel came to stand beside her at the rail. The dock lights were already shrinking behind them. "You don't have to be here," he said. Not unkindly, just stating a fact he felt obligated to state. "Someone has to be," she said. "You've got tactical people and federal people and a very determined dog. None of them have a trauma kit and the skills to use it. Our guys have field medicine. Your guys have field medicine designed for field guys in an optimal scenario." She gripped the rail as the boat hit its first real swell and the deck tilted. Her stomach registered an objection that she filed away. "I have field medicine designed for whatever is actually happening. Those are different things." Sorrel was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you serve?" "Kandahar rotation. Then a second one I can't get into at a dinner party." He made a sound that might have been almost a laugh. "Yeah, same." They didn't talk much after that. The ocean was too loud and the work of standing upright on a moving deck was its own occupation. Rachel focused on the horizon, or where the horizon would have been if the sky and the water weren't the same shade of black, and breathed through her mouth and thought about the strip of green webbing in her pocket, and the man whose hands had written those coordinates with enough care to mean he intended for them to be found. Bravo still active. Active meant ongoing. Active meant current. Active meant someone, somewhere, had a mission that the official record said was finished and was still running it anyway. Alone. For 3 years, by the timeline, or 18 months by the shorter count, depending on which part of the story you were measuring. She thought about what that did to a person. She had been in difficult places for weeks at a time and come out of them changed in ways she was still discovering. 3 years on a decommissioned island with no extraction and no confirmation that anyone was coming. She didn't try to fully imagine it because some math you do out of respect for the person who lived it, not curiosity. The island appeared out of the dark like a rumor becoming fact. It was larger than she'd expected from a map designation, maybe 3 miles coast to coast, heavily wooded, the shoreline a mix of rocky shelf and narrow gravel beach that the storm was currently using as a percussion instrument. No lights visible, no structures from the water, just tree line and wet rock and the particular blankness of a place that had been left alone long enough to forget it was supposed to be accessible. Pollock brought them around to the leeward side, where a natural inlet cut the swells down to something manageable. There was a dock there, old, listing, but the posts were still in the rock and the planking held when the first tactical man tested it. Someone had maintained it, not recently, but not never. Ridgeline was on the dock before anyone cleared him to disembark. He hit the planking, shook once, and turned to look at Rachel with that same waiting expression. "Okay," she said. "Show me." He moved into the tree line at a pace that was urgent without being panicked. The kind of pace that said this way and keep up, and I know exactly where I'm going without a word of any of it. The tactical team spread around them in a pattern Rachel recognized from her time embedded with security details. A loose perimeter, enough spacing to cover angles, close enough to react. Dre moved behind her. Sorrel was on her left. The two remaining agents took the flanks. The island's interior was dense. Whatever the military had used it for before decommissioning had left only faint traces. A cleared sight line here, a flattened area there. The ghost of infrastructure that had long since been swallowed by coastal scrub and pine. The ground was wet through, and twice Rachel's boot found a depression that she didn't see coming, and both times Sorrel's hand was there at her elbow, without announcement or comment, and both times she didn't say anything either because there was nothing worth saying. Ridgeline stopped. The structure was not visible until you were almost on top of it. A former fire observation tower. The coastal monitoring kind, built in the mid-20th century. The wooden kind that looked romantic from a distance and structurally ambiguous up close. Someone had reinforced the base level. Not with lumber, with materials that were newer, deliberate. The windows on the lowest floor were dark but covered from the inside, which meant there was something worth covering. Thermal, Dre said quietly, and one of the tactical men lifted a scanner. A pause, then, single heat signature, ground floor, stationary. Rachel felt something in her chest do a complicated thing. Ridgeline sat at the base of the tower door and looked up at it. Then back at them. Patient. This is the place. This is the person. Open the door. Sorrel moved forward. His hand went to the door. An old wooden panel, reinforced with a metal bar on the inside. The kind that you could only open from within. He knocked 3 times, then paused, then 2 times. 3, 2. The inverse of the beacon signal. Silence. Then, from inside, the sound of something moving. Slow. The kind of slow that was either caution or damage, and she was already opening her trauma kit in her head, running the checklist because it didn't matter which one it was, the response was the same. A bar being lifted. The scrape of it. The door opened inward and for a moment there was only darkness in the gap. Then a shape. A man. He was standing, which surprised her, because the heat signature had been stationary long enough that she'd started picturing prone. He was tall, or had been. He was standing the way people stand when they've been hurt, in a way the spine remembers, slightly forward, weight distributed wrong. His face was in shadow. His right arm stayed against the doorframe. His left was held close to his body in the particular configuration of a chronic injury being protected by long habit. He looked at the group on his doorstep. His gaze moved across Dre, Sorrel, the tactical team. He showed nothing. Military face, the kind that had been trained into nothing showing on the surface. Then Ridgeline made a sound, low, not a bark. Something older than a bark. The man looked down. Something happened in his face that Rachel did not have a clinical word for. It was not happiness exactly. It was the expression of someone who has been certain of one fact for a very long time and has just received evidence that the fact was wrong. A particular kind of relief so heavy it was almost indistinguishable from grief. He said one word, a name, the dog's name, and his voice cracked on the second syllable in a way that was entirely human and entirely beyond any performance. Ridgeline crossed the gap between them in 3 strides and pressed his head against the man's good hand, and the man's hand came down slowly and rested on the dog's neck. And they stayed like that for a moment that nobody in the tree line moved through. Rachel stepped forward. "Captain Drake," she said. "I'm Rachel Hayes. I'm a nurse and a former 68W. I need to look at that arm." He raised his eyes to her. They were dark and steady and held the particular quality of someone who had been alone long enough that being looked at directly by another person required a beat of adjustment. He looked at her for a long second. "He found you," Drake said. Not a question. Something slower, more deliberate, like a man confirming a thing he had calculated and bet on from a very long distance. "I wasn't sure he'd make it. The water—" He stopped, swallowed. The restraint of a man who had been his own only audience for a very long time and was not certain how to inhabit a room with other people without the armor of that solitude. "He made it," Rachel said. 11 miles, 1 storm. He's okay." She kept her voice level, clinical but not cold. "I still need to look at that arm." Drake looked down at the arm he'd been holding against his body, then back at her. There was a flicker of something in his expression, Not resistance, exactly. The vestigial reflex of a man who had been managing everything alone and had not yet retrained the reflex of, I'll deal with it myself. Okay, he said finally. Yeah. He stepped back from the doorway, and as Rachel moved past the threshold, her headlamp catching the interior for the first time, she stopped. The walls were covered, not haphazardly, with intent, with system, with the careful architecture of someone who had been building an argument one piece at a time for years. Maps, photographs, documents in plastic sleeves, strings connecting points, names she didn't recognize in handwriting that was the same as the green webbing in her pocket. And among the names, circled in red, repeated across multiple documents in multiple contexts, a network of connections that made the back of her neck do the thing again. But what stopped her was not the map or the documents or even the circled names. It was the other door, the one at the far end of the room, the one with the light coming from under it, the one with multiple voices behind it, at least 3, she thought, and one of them was crying very quietly in the way of someone who has been crying for a long time and has nearly run out of the energy required to stop. Drake watched her register it. There are 4 of them, he said. 2 military, 2 civilian. The civilians have been here 11 days. His voice was flat now, functional, the voice of a situation report. The military personnel. They were on a transport that was diverted. They don't know by who. I found them on the North Shore a week ago. Rachel looked at the door. 4 people. 11 days, minimum, for the civilians. She was already reconstructing the medical picture in her head. Dehydration, exposure, psychological state, potential injuries she couldn't see yet, while another part of her mind was pulling at the edges of what Drake had just said. They don't know by who. A diverted military transport. Civilians on a decommissioned restricted island. A distress beacon that had been broadcasting for 6 hours but somehow hadn't registered in the automated systems until someone made a phone call in the right direction. A classified operation that had been discontinued. Documents on a wall, names in red, a network of something that Drake had been building alone for 3 years because he had apparently decided that if he could not get out, he would at minimum compile the case that would matter when someone finally came in. She turned to find Sorrel directly behind her. He was looking at the wall. His expression had changed, not dramatically, just the eyes. They had gone to the particular stillness of a man whose understanding of the situation he is standing inside has just significantly expanded. Sorrel, she said quietly. Yeah, he said, still looking at the wall. Who discontinued Operation Harrow? He didn't answer immediately. The sound of the storm was distant through the reinforced walls, muffled and constant, the white noise of a world outside that didn't know this room existed. Ridgeline was still at Drake's side. Drake was watching Sorrel with an expression that was not hostile exactly, but was not warm either. The expression of a man who has spent a considerable amount of time thinking about the people who were not there when they should have been, and has not yet determined where the line was between negligence and something worse. Sorrel finally turned from the wall to look at Rachel. His face was doing the careful thing, the managing thing, but underneath it, she could see the edges of something that she recognized as a man confronting a thing he would rather not confront. I need to make a call, he said. You do that, she said. I'm going to go check on those 4 people. She picked up her trauma kit, looked at Sorrel one more time. When you make that call, you might want to ask your command why a distress beacon broadcasting on a military frequency took 6 hours to reach anyone who cared. She pushed open the inner door before he could answer. Behind it were 4 people in various states of what 3 years, or 11 days, or some number of hours of sustained fear and isolation did to a human body. A woman in her 30s with a gash on her forearm that had been field-dressed by someone who knew what they were doing. Drake, probably. A man closer to 50 with the shallow breathing of someone whose ribs were not happy. 2 soldiers, both younger, one with a wrapped ankle and eyes that tracked Rachel's entry with the instinctive wariness of people who had learned that doors opening was not reliably good news. My name is Rachel Hayes, she said, and set her kit on the floor and opened it. I'm a nurse. I'm also former Army. Nobody here is in danger anymore. She looked at each face. Let that land. I'm going to start with whoever's hurting the most. Someone tell me. The woman with the gash raised her other hand slightly, not asking for help, indicating a priority. Practical. Rachel moved to her and began unwrapping the field dressing, and as she worked, she heard through the thin walls Sorrel's voice on his phone, and the particular cadence of a man saying things to someone upstream that he was going to have a very hard time walking back. Outside, the storm was still going. The boat was still at the dock. 11 miles of black water lay between this island and the mainland. And on the wall in the outer room, a name circled in red appeared 7 times across 3 different documents, attached to 7 different transactions, in 7 different years, connected by Mason Drake's careful handwriting to a network that reached. Rachel had seen enough of it to know this much, considerably higher than any of them had walked in here expecting. Her hands kept working. Clean the wound, assess the damage, stop the bleeding, the same as it had always been, the same as it would always be. But her mind was already on the name she'd seen on the wall, and on the fact that Sorrel had gone very quiet the moment he'd seen it, and on the cold specific possibility that the person who had buried this operation, who had falsified the records and suppressed the beacon and left 4 people and 1 soldier on an island that didn't officially exist, was not some abstract institutional failure, was a person, with a name, who was currently on the mainland, asleep possibly, unaware that a dog had walked 11 miles through a storm and led 6 federal agents and 1 former Army nurse to the one room in the world that held the evidence to end them. Rachel tied off the bandage, looked up at the woman whose arm she'd just dressed. "What's your name?" she asked. The woman's jaw was tight with the effort of not shaking. "Miriam Voss," she said. And the last name hit Rachel like a door to the face. She kept her expression neutral through the kind of sustained effort that her Army years had made possible. Voss. The same name as the hospital administrator currently suspended from involvement in her ER. She filed it immediately in the part of her mind she kept for things that were too large and too specific to be coincidence, and said only, "Okay, Miriam, you're going to be all right. Try to breathe slow." But her hands, invisible to the room, had gone briefly cold. The woman's name hit the room like a stone dropped into still water, and Rachel held the ripples inside her chest where no one could see them. Miriam Voss. 41 by the look of her, close enough to the administrator's age that the arithmetic was already doing itself without Rachel's permission. Same last name, same bone structure around the jaw, now that Rachel was looking for it. The woman was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had spent 11 days reading faces for signs of whether the next development would be good or bad, and Rachel made sure her own face gave her exactly nothing to read. "How long has the arm been like this?" Rachel asked. 5 days? Maybe 6. I stopped counting after day 3. Miriam's voice was steadier than her hands. "The man who... the one outside. He dressed it. He had supplies. He did a good job." Rachel was not saying that to be kind. The field dressing was clean, the wound edges approximated correctly, no obvious sign of infection despite the conditions and the timeline. Drake had done this in a dim room with limited resources and gotten it right, which told her something about the level of care he had been operating at. "It's going to need proper cleaning and antibiotics as soon as we get you back. You'll keep the arm." Miriam exhaled. Not relief exactly. More like the release of a question she had been holding so long it had become structural. Rachel moved to the man with the labored breathing. He gave his name as Aldert. Didn't offer more. Late 50s, gray at the temples, the hands of someone who had worked with them for decades. She put 2 fingers to his wrist, checked his pulse, steady but elevated, and pressed carefully along his rib cage until he flinched at the 4th intercostal space on his left side. He sucked in a sharp breath and tried to cover it. "Cracked," she said. "Not displaced. You've been splinting it with your arm, which is why you're breathing shallow." She looked at him directly. "That's actually the right call. Keep doing it. Deep breath every 20 minutes, even though it hurts, or you'll develop atelectasis, and that's worse than the pain." He nodded. The look he gave her was not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent. The expression of a man who had been managing something frightening alone and had just been handed a fact that made it less frightening and was processing the specific relief of that. She moved to the 2 soldiers. A young woman, specialist rank by the uniform remnant she was still wearing, ankle wrapped in strips of fabric with the kind of improvised but functional compression that again bore Drake's signature. A young man, barely 23 by the look of him, whose eyes had the flat quality that Rachel had seen in field situations and recognized as the outer edge of acute stress response. Not dissociation yet, but close. She spoke to him for 60 seconds in a register that was quiet and even and made no demands, and watched some of the flatness recede. Not disappear. Recede. That was all she could do in the next 10 minutes. Recede was enough. She was doing a final visual sweep of the room when Sorrel appeared in the inner doorway. He had the look of a man who had made his phone call and come back changed by it in a way he was still digesting. "We need to move within the hour," he said. "Tide situation. These four need stabilization before they board anything in these conditions." Rachel kept her voice level. "The man has cracked ribs. The woman has a 5-day-old wound that needs irrigation. Another 20 minutes. Rachel, 20 minutes. Not a negotiation. If we put Aldert on a boat right now in 12-foot swells without taping that rib cage, he risks a pneumothorax in transit. Then instead of managing 4 recovering patients, we're managing a crisis in open water. Understand?" Sorrel looked at Aldert, at the wall beyond the doorway, back at Rachel. 20 minutes, he said. She was already reaching for the tape. Drake did not come inside while she worked. She could see him through the doorway. Standing in the outer room, Ridgeline pressed against his leg, looking at the wall he had built across 3 years of isolation, not studying it, something more intimate than studying. The look of a man confronting something he had made in the absence of any other option and was now seen for the first time through other people's eyes. When she had done everything she could do in the available time and the available space, Rachel came out and stood beside him. She did not say "this is impressive" or "you've been busy" or any of the other inadequate things that fit the shape of the moment. She looked at the wall and let it be what it was, which was 3 years of one person's refusal to accept that the truth would stay buried. "You knew someone would come," she said. "I thought someone might." He didn't look at her. "I wasn't sure it would be in time." "In time for what?" He turned then. The lamplight. She had set up 2 portable lights while she worked, and they threw the room in a warm, inadequate yellow, caught the angles of his face. He was not what she had expected, though she hadn't let herself expect much. He was probably 40, but wore it unevenly, the way people do when some of those years were harder than the others. There was a precision about him, in how he held himself, in how he chose what he said, that survived the evidence of everything he had been through. That kind of precision was not trained, it was character. "There's a shipment," he said. "If my timeline is right, 48 hours, maybe less. The network I documented, they run transports through this corridor. Have been for 3 years. I've logged 14 of them." His voice was flat and precise and gave her the information without ornamentation. The people in that room, the 2 civilians, they were intercepted from one of those transports. Not military, logistics people. They saw something they weren't supposed to see, and someone decided it was easier to make them disappear than deal with the alternative. Rachel processed that. And the 2 soldiers? Their transport was diverted. My read is that someone on the logistics side of the network flagged their flight plan as an anomaly. They were doing an aerial survey of this coastline, routine maintenance check. Someone got nervous. He paused. "They've been here 8 days. The network doesn't know I'm here, or didn't. After I sent Ridgeline..." He stopped, looked at the dog. "I don't know what timeline they're on now." "You sent him alone," Rachel said. 11 miles. In a storm. He's done worse." The way he said it was not boastful. It was the voice of someone stating a fact about a partner they had trusted their life to enough times that trust had become a different thing entirely. Not belief, but knowledge. "I couldn't leave. Not with 4 people here, and no way to know if anyone would find them." He met her eyes. "I needed someone who already knew how to read him." "You didn't know I'd be there." "I knew the nearest military-adjacent medical facility was Redwood Memorial. I knew a former 68W had been working their ER for about 8 months. I kept tabs on the region when I could, when the radio cooperated. I figured if he walked in there, someone would know what he was trying to say. A beat. I didn't know it would be you specifically, but I hoped it would be someone like you. Rachel looked at the wall again. At a photograph she could now make out more clearly. An aerial image of the coastline, annotated in Drake's handwriting, with approach routes marked and a schedule of what appeared to be boat movements logged in the margins. 14 transports, 3 years. One man with a radio and a long view, and enough stubbornness to build a case when he couldn't build an exit. The name circled in red, she said. A pause. Dalton Reeve, Drake said. She didn't know the name, but she could see, even from a brief scan of the wall, that Reeve appeared in the documents the way load-bearing walls appear in a building. Not always visible, but structural. Everything rested on him. Who is he? Defense Procurement, Senior Acquisitions Officer, Pacific Regional Command. He has been facilitating the network's access to decommissioned military logistics infrastructures, including this island, for 6 years. He is also, Drake said, in a voice that had gone very deliberate, the person who signed the order discontinuing Operation Harrow. The room seemed to contract slightly. He buried you, Rachel said. He buried the op because we were getting close. We didn't know what we were getting close to at the time. We thought it was a localized smuggling issue, human trafficking component, some corrupt contractors, standard enough for a task force. But we'd gotten into his supply chain and he knew it, so he called the op. Drake's jaw tightened, and then he made sure I couldn't come home to talk about it. How? The second incident, the one that put me KIA. His hand, the good one, moved briefly to the arm he kept close to his body, not quite touching it. I was on an extraction. Someone fed bad coordinates to my transport. I ended up in the water 2 miles from here. Ridgeline was with me. The island was the only option. He said all of this with the controlled cadence of a man who had told the story to himself so many times that the telling had become separate from the feeling, which was its own kind of damage that Rachel recognized and cataloged, and did not comment on because they were 48 hours from a shipment, and this was not the moment for that conversation. Sorrel needs to hear all of this, she said. Sorrel needs to hear some of it, Drake said carefully. There's a difference. She looked at him. You don't trust the chain. I trust parts of it. I don't know which parts. He looked at the doorway. Dre, the federal agent. He came from a different branch of the investigation, different from Sorrel's command. That's why they're both here tonight, which is interesting. Rachel had noticed that. The slight friction between the two men, the way they moved around each other with the courtesy of people who were technically on the same side and practically uncertain of exactly how much of the same side that was. She had cataloged it and set it aside, and now Drake was pulling it back to the surface. You think Sorrel's command is compromised, she said. I think Dalton Reeve has been in his position for 6 years, which means he has had 6 years to develop relationships in the command structure. I think the fact that my beacon broadcast for 6 hours before anyone responded is a data point. He looked at her steadily. And I think you already thought this, because you're standing here having this conversation with me instead of standing out there having it with Sorrel. She had. She had been thinking it since the phone call, since the specific quality of Sorrel's careful voice, since the way he had looked at the wall and gone still. She had not been able to determine whether his stillness was the stillness of complicity or the stillness of a man confronting the possibility that people above him were not what he had believed. Those two stillnesses looked almost identical from the outside. We need to move the evidence, Rachel said, before we move the people. Drake looked at the wall. I've been photographing it for 2 weeks. Everything's on a drive. He reached into his jacket with his good arm and produced a drive no larger than his thumb. Standard military spec, the kind of hardware that could survive immersion and impact and general catastrophic events. The originals stay. The drive goes with someone who isn't in the chain of command. He held it out to her. She took it. It was lighter than 3 years of work had any right to be. Moving 4 injured people through a storm-soaked island in the dark, across terrain that had had 3 years of unmanaged growth to get complicated, was the kind of task that stripped everything down to its functional components. Rachel operated on the logic of triage in motion, prioritize the ribs, protect the arm, keep the stress response soldier in front where she could see his eyes, manage pace so nobody falls and creates a secondary problem. Dre and two of the tactical men formed the outer perimeter. Sorrel took position near Drake. Ridgeline led. He picked the route with the same patient certainty he had shown on every leg of this, finding the firmest ground, pausing at obstacles long enough for the slower members of the group to navigate them, glancing back periodically in the way of an animal that understood it was responsible for the people behind it. Rachel had stopped finding this remarkable in the abstract. She found it remarkable in the specific, operational, immediate sense of this animal is the best navigator in this group, and that was simply the fact of the situation, and she was going to use it. They were 40 meters from the dock when Ridgeline stopped. Not a navigation stop. A full stop. Weight shifted to his haunches, ears forward, head low, the body language of an animal that had registered something the humans hadn't. Rachel put her hand up. The group stopped. She listened. The storm was loud enough to mask a lot, but underneath it there was a sound that didn't fit the ambient pattern of wind and rain and water. An engine, low, idling. Not Pollock's boat. This was a different pitch, a different rhythm, coming from the North Shore. Dre was beside her in 2 steps. He had a hand up to his earpiece. He listened. His face went through 2 expressions she couldn't quite read in the dark and settled on something controlled and unpleasant. "We have a vessel," he said, very quietly. "North approach. Just dropped anchor. Multiple persons disembarking." Drake was already moving putts. Closer to the tree line, pulling Miriam with him, the gesture practiced and without urgency but absolutely decisive. "How many?" he said. "Unknown." Dre looked at his tactical team. Silent communication, the hand signal language of people who had trained for exactly this contingency. "Our signal may have been monitored." "Or they made the same calculation I did about the tide window," Drake said. 48-hour timeline was an estimate. If something moved, it moved, Dre said. Rachel looked at the dock. Pollock's boat was still there, 20 meters through the open ground between the tree line and the water. Open ground. In the dark, in a storm, which offered some concealment, but not enough for a group that included a man with cracked ribs and a woman with one functional arm. She looked at the 2 soldiers. The young woman with the wrapped ankle met her eyes. Steadier than she'd been in the room, adrenaline doing what adrenaline does, which was not always the same as what you needed, but was currently what was available. The young man was alert. Whatever the acute stress response had taken from him, the physical threat had given some of it back. "Can you run?" Rachel asked the ankle. "I can move fast," Specialist, she had given her name as Tara, said. "It won't be pretty." "Doesn't need to be pretty." Rachel looked at Aldert. "You tape your own ribs?" "I heard the instructions," he said, and his voice was dry enough that she almost respected it. "Stay on the exhale when we move. Don't fight the pain. Move with it." She looked at Miriam, arm against your chest. "Don't let it swing." Then she looked at Sorrel, who was already talking into his earpiece, and the specific tenor of his conversation told her they were coordinating something she was not party to. And she made a decision she had made before in noisier and more dangerous versions of this same essential situation. Trust the person in front of you. Verify later. "Sorrel," she said, "tell me what you need from me." He looked at her, just briefly. The assessment again, the calculation. Then, "Get them to the boat. My people will cover." "And Drake?" Sorrel's jaw tightened. He glanced at Drake, who was watching him with the expression of a man who had been alone for 3 years and was very good by now at reading the difference between a person who was going to do the right thing and a person who was going to do the convenient thing. "He comes with us," Sorrel said. Something in Drake's posture, infinitesimal, probably invisible to anyone who hadn't been watching him in lamplight for the past 30 minutes, eased. "Then let's go," Rachel said. What happened next was not clean or cinematic or the kind of thing that looked good in a debrief. It was 40 meters of compromised people moving through wet, dark terrain as fast as their collective limitations allowed. While behind them, she could hear, or thought she could hear, it was hard to know what was the storm and what was not. Movement in the tree line that was not their movement. Dre's people were somewhere in that sound. She did not look back to check because looking back cost her the 2 seconds of attention she needed for the person directly in front of her. Tara went down once, not hard, a stumble, caught herself on one knee, back up in under 3 seconds without being told to. Rachel filed a small piece of something that was not quite pride, because pride was the wrong word for what you felt about a stranger who was simply being competent under pressure. Closer to recognition. She'd been that person. She knew how much it cost. They reached the dock. Pollock materialized out of the dark at the boat's helm with the expression of a man who had heard the secondary engine and drawn the correct conclusions and was now very interested in getting out of the area. "Get them aboard," Rachel said. She stayed on the dock while Dre's men loaded the 4 survivors. Drake went last, Ridgeline beside him, the dog stepping onto the deck with a steadiness that the storm had no apparent interest in disturbing. Rachel counted heads, counted again. "Sorrel," she said, turning. He was there, just behind her, on the dock. His earpiece was going. His hand was pressed to it. His face had gone somewhere specific and contained, and she watched him arrive at a decision. She could see him arriving at the way you can sometimes see weather changing before it changes. A shift in the atmosphere, a pressure differential, something clarifying. He lowered his hand, looked at her. "We got 2 of theirs," he said. "North Shore, Dre's team." A pause. There were 4. Rachel looked at the tree line. "Where are the other 2? "That's the current question," Sorrel said. The boat's engines were running. Pollock's voice came from the helm, tight and clipped. "We need to go, now. Tide's turning." But Rachel was watching Ridgeline. The dog had come back to the edge of the boat and was looking at the island, not toward the tree line where the 2 missing persons presumably were. Toward the North Shore, a different angle, further right than the approach Dre's people had taken. And he was doing the pacing thing again, the small contained arc of an animal trying to communicate something that had no language. "There's someone else," Rachel said. Sorrel followed her gaze. "Rachel, he did this in the hospital, the same movement. He was trying to tell me to go somewhere." She looked at Drake, who was on the boat's stern, watching the dog. His eyes moved from Ridgeline to the North Shore and back, and she saw him work it out. The same calculation she was making, faster, because he had 3 years of learning to read this animal. "Supply cache," Drake said, his voice carrying over the engine and the wind. "North Shore past the anchor point. There's a secondary depression. Natural. Looked like a sinkhole from above. I've been using it for storage." He paused. "If they found it—" "What's in it?" Dre said. Drake looked at him, the steady, careful look of a man managing what information he released and in what order. "Physical records," he said. "The originals. Everything that isn't on the drive." Dre and Sorrel's eyes met across the deck. "If they take that cache," Drake said, "the drive is the only copy." The storm hit the dock in a gust that made the boat strain against its lines and sent Rachel's braid across her face. She pushed it back, looked at Ridgeline still pacing his small arc, looked at the North Shore, invisible in the dark, and the rain, where 2 men from a network that had buried a soldier and imprisoned 4 civilians and run 14 illegal transports through a corridor they controlled were currently, possibly, standing over a cache of physical evidence that represented 3 years of one person's impossible work. Pollock's voice again. 60 seconds. Then I'm going whether or not everyone's aboard." Sorrel looked at Rachel. She looked at him. Neither of them was the kind of person who waited for the other one to make the decision first. "Go," she said to Pollock. "Get them out." She stepped off the dock and back onto the island, and Sorrel was already moving, and behind them both she heard Dre order 2 of his tactical men to follow, and she heard the boat's engine change pitch as Pollock began to pull away, and she did not look back at that either, because looking back was not going to help anything. Ridgeline landed beside her on the gravel shore. She had not seen him leave the boat. He was just there, which was, she was beginning to understand, simply what he did. The North Shore was a quarter-mile through terrain she did not know, in a storm that was not cooperating, with 2 unknown persons somewhere in the dark and 3 years of irreplaceable evidence sitting in a hole in the ground, and the tide was turning, and Sorrel was 3 paces ahead of her with a tactical light scanning the tree line, and Ridgeline broke into a run that she and every person behind her matched without discussion, because the dog knew where they were going, and there was no longer any time to deliberate about anything. She heard the cache before she saw it. Not the cache itself. A voice. Male. Speaking not English. She caught two words she recognized from years of operational context. Coordinates and transmit. And then, above the voice and the storm and the sound of their own movement through the underbrush, a second sound. A shot. Single. Not suppressed. Coming from the direction they were running toward. Rachel did not stop. She pulled her trauma kit tighter against her body and kept running, because somewhere ahead one of Dre's tactical men had discharged a weapon on a decommissioned island in a federal operation that was already tangled with classified records and potential command-level corruption, and whatever came next in the next 60 seconds was going to require either her skills or a miracle, and she had never counted on miracles. Ridgeline was 10 meters ahead of them when he stopped at the edge of a depression in the ground. The sinkhole Drake had described, maybe 12 feet across, partially covered by netting and dead brush, in a configuration that was clearly maintained and clearly had not protected it tonight, because the cover had been pulled aside, and two figures were at the edge of it, and one of Dre's tactical men was on the ground and not moving, and the second figure had something in his hand that was not a weapon, and was not evidence, and was not anything good. And he looked up as Rachel broke through the tree line, and his face did the thing faces do in the specific half-second before a person decides whether to run or fight. He ran. Sorrel went after him. The second tactical man covered the figure still at the cache's edge, who was now on his knees with his hands up, having apparently made the other calculation. Rachel dropped to the tactical man on the ground. His name was, she didn't know. She would learn later. Right now she knew his vitals, which she established in under 10 seconds. Pulse present, strong, breathing unobstructed, no visible entry wound, which meant the shot had not connected or had connected somewhere not immediately visible. She ran her hands across his back, his sides. Found it at the left shoulder blade. A crease, not a penetration, the specific injury of a round that had taken a piece of surface tissue and kept moving. Painful, bloody, not immediately life-threatening if she controlled the bleeding now. She controlled the bleeding. Her hands worked in the rain on the wet ground, while somewhere behind her Sorrel was crashing through the underbrush after the second figure, and the tactical man's partner was securing the kneeling figure with restraints and calling something into his earpiece, and Ridgeline had positioned himself at the edge of the depression, looking down into the cache with his ears forward. "Talk to me," Rachel said to the man under her hands. "Not a request. He took a breath. "I'm okay." "You're not okay. You have a laceration across your scapula that's going to need a surgical consult. But you're going to be okay. Different thing. Stay still." He stayed still. She had the bleeding slowed in 4 minutes. Not stopped, slowed. Field standard. It would hold for transport. It was only then, with her hands occupied and her body working on the autopilot that long training builds, that she registered what Ridgeline was doing. He was still at the edge of the cache depression. Still looking down, and he had begun to make the low sound, the one he'd made when Drake opened the door. Not distress, not alarm, recognition. Rachel looked into the depression. The cache was deep. Drake had dug it well. The walls were reinforced with timber scraps, the floor lined with waterproof sheeting, the contents organized with the methodical care of someone who had needed to be able to find things in the dark. Documents in labeled binders. Photographs in sealed bags, a radio set, compact, military surplus. And at the far end of the depression, behind a sealed case she assumed held the physical record copies, was something that had not been part of Drake's inventory, a secondary beacon transmitter, not military spec. Commercial, modified, the kind of equipment that got used by private logistics operations who needed to track cargo movement without official oversight. It was active. She could see the small red pulse of the transmission light, steady and rhythmic. It had been placed there recently. Tonight, almost certainly. By the man now on his knees in zip cuffs 6 feet from her, or by the man Sorrel was currently chasing through a storm-wet island in the dark. She understood what she was looking at in the space of about 3 seconds. A transponder. Placed inside the cache of evidence that Drake had been building for 3 years. Placed there tonight, by operatives who had not come to take the evidence. They had come to locate it, and to transmit its precise position to someone who was not on this island. which meant someone not on this island now knew exactly where every piece of Drake's physical record was, which meant the drive in her pocket was no longer a redundancy. It was the only copy that was going anywhere useful. Rachel looked up from the depression. The rain was hitting her face, and the tactical man's blood was on her hands, and Ridgeline was watching her with steady dark eyes. And she had exactly one thought that had the clarity of something arriving rather than being constructed. Whoever was on the receiving end of that transmission was now making decisions, and she had no idea how long they had before those decisions produced consequences that arrived on this island or somewhere else. She stood, pressed the wound dressing with one hand, and raised her voice over the storm. "Dre," she called. "I need you at the cache, now." He appeared in 20 seconds, looked at what she was looking at. His expression did not change, but his hand went immediately to his earpiece, and she heard him say 4 words before she stopped being able to hear over the wind. Those 4 words were, "We have a problem." And in her pocket, the drive with 3 years of evidence pressed against her ribs, and somewhere on the mainland a phone was ringing in an office or a house or a hotel room, and someone was about to answer it and receive coordinates that would tell them exactly how much had just been compromised. Rachel looked at Ridgeline. He looked back at her with the patient certainty of an animal who had started this in a storm and was not, apparently, finished yet. Her hands were still bleeding through the dressing. She didn't notice for almost 30 seconds. The bleeding on her hands was from the dressing work, not a wound. She established this in the same clinical detachment she used to assess everyone else, pressing her palm flat and finding no pain beneath the blood, just the sticky residue of someone else's injury that had transferred during the field work. She wiped her hands on her pants and turned back to Dre, who was already crouched at the edge of the cache depression with a light on the transponder. "Don't touch it," she said. "I know not to touch it," he said without irritation, which meant he was too focused for irritation, which meant the situation had his full attention in a way it perhaps hadn't entirely before this moment. "Can you determine when it was placed?" Not without a sweep. He was already on his earpiece again. She heard him request a technical asset, which meant someone with equipment, which meant they were calling in more people, which meant the radius of this operation was expanding in real time, and she had no visibility into where the outer edges were. Sorrel came back through the tree line with the second figure in restraints ahead of him. The man was younger than she'd expected. Late 20s, civilian clothing that was too good for the terrain, the kind of person who had expected to be in and out of this island in 40 minutes, and had not accounted for a German shepherd or a former army nurse or federal agents who moved faster than their official timeline suggested. His face was a composition of calculation and fear doing their specific negotiation, and he was not talking, which was the choice of either training or legal instinct, and she couldn't tell which. Sorrel handed him to the second tactical man and came to stand at the cache edge beside Dre. The 3 of them looked at the transponder together. The red pulse was steady, rhythmic, broadcasting to a receiver that was presumably in range, presumably being monitored, presumably attached to a person who was now deciding what to do with the information. "How long has it been active?" Sorrel asked. "We don't know," Dre said. "Best estimate. Since before we arrived. Could be hours. Could be less." Rachel watched Sorrel absorb this. The particular quality of his absorption, the still kind, not the blank kind, told her he was doing the same math she was, arriving at the same answer. Someone had known they were coming, or had anticipated the possibility, and had placed a device designed not to extract the evidence, but to mark it, to tell someone else where it was, to allow for a later action that the person who placed the transponder would not be present for. "He didn't come to take it," Rachel said. "He came to report it. Report its existence and location," Dre said. "Yes." Which means whoever received that transmission is now aware that Drake's physical record is intact, located, and in federal hands. She paused. "And they're aware that people who know about Dalton Reeve are currently on this island." Neither man said anything for a moment. "They'll move," Sorrel said. "They're already moving," Dre said. Rachel looked at the drive in her hand. She had taken it out without fully registering that she had, some protective instinct in her fingers working ahead of her conscious decision. The drive with 3 years of documentation. Names, transactions, dates, transport logs, the 14 shipments Drake had observed and recorded. and at the center of it all, Dalton Reeves' name, repeated like a structural element. She closed her fist around it. "Then we need to be faster than whatever they're doing," she said, "and we need to not lose this." Dre looked at her closed fist, then at her face. He was a man who had spent a career assessing people in compressed time frames, and she could feel him doing it now, measuring what she was, what she represented, what she was likely to do with something she was holding. She held his gaze and let him measure. "Secure it," he said finally. "Keep it on you." She put it back in her inside pocket and pressed the zipper closed. The boat ride back was nothing like the ride out. The storm had not improved. If anything, the swells had reorganized into something more sustained. Longer intervals between peaks, but more momentum in each one. The kind of sea state that didn't feel immediately dangerous until you were on the wrong side of one. But the quality of silence among the people on the deck was different from the silence on the way out. On the way out, it had been the silence of moving toward an unknown. This was the silence of people who had seen the unknown and were now processing what it contained. Drake sat at the stern, ridgeline pressed against his leg. He had not spoken since the island, which Rachel read not as withdrawal but as the necessary internal accounting of a man who had spent 3 years alone with a plan and was now in the disorienting position of watching that plan move forward without his hands on any of it. She knew something about that specific helplessness, the particular frustration of being the person who built the thing, watching other people carry it. She sat down beside him, not because she had something clinical to offer, just because the seat was there and he was clearly not fine, and she was the person who had come the farthest from her actual job description to get here. He didn't acknowledge her immediately. She didn't require it. After a while, over the engine and the water, he said, "Miriam Voss." "Yes," Rachel said. "You recognize the name." "The hospital administrator who put me on mandatory leave 3 days ago has the same last name." She kept her voice level. "I don't know if it's the same family. I didn't ask her." "It is," Drake said. "Harlan Voss. He's been a secondary node in Reeves' network for 4 years. Administrative access to hospital logistics. Specifically, the medical supply chains that run through the same coastal corridor. He processes paperwork, legitimate-looking invoices for equipment that doesn't exist or moves at a fraction of the declared weight." He looked at her. "You worked for him." Rachel felt the specific cold of a thing she should have seen coming and hadn't. Not guilt. She had no reason to have known. The cold of retroactive clarity, the moment when context recontextualizes a series of ordinary events into something else entirely. Voss dismissing her. Voss's particular attention to her movements in the department, the way he had appeared at midnight and gone silent when Sorrel's ID came out. "He was watching me," she said, "or watching the ER, for exactly this kind of situation." "Probably." Drake looked at the water. "You made his life difficult by being good at your job, and then a dog walked into his hospital and made his life considerably more difficult in a different way." She thought about Miriam sitting in the inner room of the tower with a 5-day wound and the patience of someone who had run out of alternative options. She thought about Miriam raising her hand to indicate priority, the practical gesture of a person managing their own situation even when their situation was beyond managing. "She knew who I was," Rachel said. "It wasn't a question." "I told her the name," Drake said, "when I dressed the arm. I didn't tell her why. I didn't know enough at that point, but I told her that if anyone came, there was a possibility it would be a nurse named Rachel Hayes, and that if that happened, she should go with her without hesitation." He paused. "I thought I was being optimistic." "You were being specific," Rachel said. "There's a difference." Something in his posture shifted slightly. Not relaxation. Something more complicated. The adjustment of a man returning to a world that still had people in it who said precise things and was finding that less alien than he'd anticipated. "Reeve doesn't know how much we have," Drake said. "The transponder tells him the cache was found. It doesn't tell him what the cache contained or how completely it's been documented. That's leverage, if Dre knows how to use it." "Does Dre know how to use it?" Drake considered. "He's careful. He's patient. He's not going to do anything for the next 48 hours that he hasn't verified twice." He looked at her sideways. "Which is good tradecraft and terrible timing." "Because Reeve is moving now," Rachel said. Because Reeve was always going to move the moment anything on that island entered federal hands. He's had a plan for this contingency. I've assumed that for 18 months. He looked back at the water. The question is whether his plan accounts for the drive. She pressed her ribs slightly, feeling the small, hard edge of it through the fabric. He doesn't know about the drive. Not yet, Drake said. But he knows about me. And if he knows about me, he'll calculate that I kept records. And if he calculates I kept records, he'll assume some of them survived. He just won't know the format or the location. He paused. Which means his first move will be to find someone inside the incoming investigation who can tell him what was recovered. They were 40 minutes from shore. Rachel sat with that for a while, letting it be as large as it actually was, which was very large. An incoming investigation that might already have a leak. A federal agent who was careful and patient in the wrong timeline. A hospital administrator whose name she'd been saying for 3 days without knowing what it meant. A man across from her who had survived 3 years on an island by being right about things, and was now, she suspected, right about this. Redwood Memorial at 6 a.m. was a different organism from Redwood Memorial at midnight. The storm had passed its worst point and left behind the particular gray clarity of a Pacific Coast dawn, the air clean and cold and carrying the smell of wet concrete and salt. The ER was in its quietest hour, the post-storm surge exhausted, the early morning routine not yet assembled. 2 nurses Rachel knew by sight moved through the corridors with the focused efficiency of people who had been through the night and were seeing the end of it. She went straight to the secure consultation room that Dre had commandeered. She did not ask how, she did not particularly care, and stood at the table while a technical analyst connected the drive to a secured federal device and began verification protocols. The room held 8 people: Dre, Sorrel, 2 of the tactical team, the analyst, Drake, Rachel, and a woman in her 50s named Calloway, who had arrived from Portland in the time it had taken them to cross the water. Calloway had the title of Special Agent in Charge, which she wore without ceremony, and she had the quality of someone who had been in this specific kind of room before and was not interested in the ambient anxiety of it. She asked Drake 3 questions in the first 2 minutes, listened to the answers without interruption, and then turned to the analyst and said, "Full chain of custody log from the moment the drive entered federal hands. Time-stamped. I want it airtight." Rachel liked her immediately. The drive's contents took 11 minutes to verify and index. 14 transport logs. Photographs. Communication intercepts that Drake had captured on his modified radio across 3 years. Fragments. Not full records, but enough. Financial documents he had photographed from materials that had washed ashore with one of the supply transports in year 2, which he had cataloged and stored with the care of a man who understood he might be the only person who would ever see them. And 3 direct communications between logistics contacts and a named recipient, referencing operational approvals for the corridor, signed with an authorization code that the analyst confirmed, in a voice that had gone carefully flat, matched Dalton Reeves' procurement office. Calloway looked at the authorization code on the screen, then at Dre. "How long to get a warrant?" "I can have a federal judge on the phone in 20 minutes, Dre said. "Do it from outside," she said. "I don't want this room involved in anything that touches a phone." She looked at Sorrel. "Your command has been notified of the recovery?" "Standard notification went up at 0400, Sorrel said. "Pull it back." Sorrel's expression did not change. "I can't pull back a filed..." "You can flag it as preliminary and request a 48-hour hold pending verification. That's within your discretion as operational lead." She met his eyes. "Do it." A beat. Rachel watched Sorrel decide. It was not a long decision, but it was a real one. The kind where you are measuring your trust in the person asking against your institutional training and arriving at a calculation about which one is more reliable in the specific present circumstance. "Done," he said, and stepped outside. Rachel looked at Drake across the table. He was watching Calloway with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his assessment face, not skeptical, not trusting, simply measuring. Building a picture. "She's clean," he said, very quietly, to no one in particular, or possibly to her. "How do you know?" she said, equally quiet. She pulled the notification hold before she asked about the warrant. She's protecting the evidence chain, not the investigation's appearance. He looked at the drive on the table. That's the order of priorities you want. Rachel thought about this. About the specific significance of what someone chose to protect first when they walked into a room. She had walked into a lot of rooms in the past 12 hours, and she had watched people make exactly those choices. And Drake was right. It mattered. The arrest of Dalton Reeve did not happen cleanly, because nothing in this had happened cleanly, and there was no particular reason the ending should break the pattern. Calloway's team moved on him at 9:47 in the morning, which was 2 hours after the federal warrant was signed, and 40 minutes after a parallel team had simultaneously executed search warrants on 3 properties connected to his logistics network. Reeve was in his office at the Pacific Regional Command building in Astoria, the kind of office that spoke to 6 years of careful positioning, with a window view of the harbor and a wall of commendations and a desk that cost more than Rachel's monthly salary. He had reportedly been on the phone when the agents entered. He had reportedly ended the call before they identified themselves. And when they did identify themselves, he had, according to Calloway's terse subsequent account, asked to see the warrant with the particular composure of a man who had rehearsed this moment enough times that the actual performance of it felt like a recall rather than a reaction. Rachel was not there. She was in the hospital, running on no sleep and black coffee, overseeing the medical handoff of 4 recovering survivors to the Redwood Memorial Clinical Team. This required a complex series of conversations with the on-call physician, a competent, cautious woman named Dr. Ferris, who had arrived to find a federal situation in her consultation room, and a nurse she'd worked with for 8 months explaining the medical status of people who had been on an island for between 8 and 11 days. And Rachel had those conversations with the methodical precision of someone who was genuinely too tired for politics. Aldert's ribs were worse than she'd managed on the island. Not a surprise, transit in rough seas had not helped. He went to imaging and came back with 2 cracked and 1 borderline fractured, none of which had shifted, which was a small mercy. Miriam's wound was cleaned properly, and she was started on IV antibiotics. And when Rachel checked on her 2 hours later, she found her sitting up in bed with the controlled expression of a woman reconstructing her own circumstances and not entirely liking the picture. "You know who my brother is," Miriam said. "Yes," Rachel said. "I haven't spoken to him in 4 years." Miriam's jaw was tight. "Not since I found out." She looked at her bandaged arm. "I told someone. Tried to report it through the right channels. And then 2 months later, I was on a civilian logistics contract that somehow ended with me on a boat that wasn't going where they told me it was going." She looked at Rachel directly. "I was the loose end." Rachel sat down because the chair was there and her legs had decided to weigh more than usual. "You reported it, and they buried it," she said. "Buried it, and then buried me." Miriam's voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have been broken and set, and the bone has healed, crooked but functional. "I want to give a full statement. To the right people. I need to know who the right people are." "Calloway," Rachel said. "Special agent in charge, federal. She's the right person." She paused. "She's clean." Miriam looked at her for a moment. "How do you know?" Rachel thought about what Drake had said in the quiet of the consultation room, the order of what a person chose to protect first. "Trust me," she said, which was not something she said easily, but she said it now and meant it. Miriam nodded. Once. The nod of someone who had been wrong about who to trust before and was making a decision about the cost of being wrong again versus the cost of not deciding. The formal unraveling of Dalton Reeve's network took, as these things do, considerably longer than the morning of the arrest, but certain things moved quickly. The 2 individuals taken into custody on the island were identified by midday: a logistics contractor with 3 aliases and a payment history that connected directly to Reeve's procurement office, and a former military communications specialist who had been quietly discharged 4 years ago and had since been earning a very different kind of salary. Both of them, facing the specific weight of federal evidence and the information that their network's operational lead had been taken into custody simultaneously, made decisions about their own interests that significantly accelerated the timeline of what Calloway's team was able to establish. Sorrell came to find Rachel in the break room at 11 in the morning. She was sitting at the table with her third coffee and the specific vacancy of a person who had been operating past their limit for long enough that the limit had become theoretical. He sat across from her without ceremony, which she appreciated. Reeve lawyered up immediately, he said. But the evidence load from the drive and the physical records is, Callaway's people are calling it comprehensive. The authorization codes alone are enough. He paused. Combined with Miriam Voss's testimony, the two contractors, and Drake's documented observations across 3 years, the prosecutor's preliminary read is that we're looking at multiple federal charges: trafficking facilitation, corruption of procurement process, falsification of military records, and, this part took me a minute to absorb, 3 counts of conspiracy related to the deaths of 2 service members and 1 contractor who were on operations that intersected with his network. Rachel looked at her coffee cup. He got people killed, covered it up, made it look like operational losses. Sorrell's voice was controlled, but underneath it was something she recognized as the particular anger of a soldier who has lost people and been told it was random and is now being told it wasn't. That anger had a specific quality. She had felt it herself in different contexts. Drake is the one who documented it. He found the connection 2 years in. That's when the physical records on the wall stopped being a general log and became a specific case file. She thought about Drake on the island, building something he couldn't know would ever be seen, because the alternative to building it was accepting that none of it mattered. The particular stubbornness required to refuse that conclusion for 3 years without anyone to confirm that refusing was the right call. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Medical hold. His arm needs surgery. 3-year-old injury, never properly set. He's been managing with it." Sorrell's voice had something in it. Not quite admiration, not quite guilt. The combination of the two, maybe. "He asked about you." She looked up. "Said to tell you, and I am quoting directly here, that he was right about the right person finding the right dog." Sorrell paused. "I think it was supposed to be a compliment." Rachel was quiet for a moment. She thought about the strip of green webbing in her pocket. Still there, she hadn't taken it out. Bravo, still active. MD, the handwriting of a man who had bet on a chain of contingencies with no guarantee that any link in that chain would hold. "What about Harlan Voss?" she said. "Warrant executed this morning. He was at the hospital." Sorrell's expression shifted into something that was not quite satisfaction, but occupied adjacent territory. Apparently he had come in for an early administrative meeting. He was taken into custody in his own office. He met her eyes. "You were formally reinstated to full-duty status about 30 minutes ago. Hospital board made the call after Callaway's office notified them of his arrest." Rachel sat with that for a moment. The reinstatement. The specific bureaucratic fact of it, arriving in a break room over cold coffee, after a night that had moved through a storm and an island and a cache and a man who had been dead for 3 years and a drive full of 3 years of one person's refusal. The weight of the reinstatement was disproportionate to the thing itself. It was one piece of paper reversing another piece of paper. But the disproportionate weight was real, and she let herself feel it for about 15 seconds before she picked up her coffee. "The network's full scope," she said. "How wide?" "Still mapping it. The transport logs Drake kept are the backbone. 14 operations over 3 years, each one connecting to a logistics chain that runs through at least 6 different contracting entities." He leaned forward slightly. "Callaway's team has identified what looks like 2 additional officials inside the regional command structure who had either active knowledge or strategic blindness, the kind of blindness you get paid for. Those cases are less clean. More time. But they'll get there." "They'll get there," he said. "The evidence base is, Drake was meticulous. He had 3 years and nothing but time, and he used it." Sorrell looked at his hands for a moment. Then, "There's going to be a debrief, formal. Callaway's office will want your full account, from the moment Ridgeline walked into the ER." He paused. "Your testimony is actually significant. You're the civilian point of entry. The chain of evidence runs through you." She had understood this, somewhere in the background of everything else. The drive had been in her possession. She had been present at the cache. She had made the call to go back to the North Shore instead of boarding the boat. These were not small things in a legal architecture that needed to be airtight. "When?" she said. This afternoon, if you're up for it. Tomorrow, if you need the time. She looked at the clock on the break room wall. She had been awake for approximately 28 hours. Her shoulder was doing the clicking thing that it did when she had been in cold and wet conditions for too long. Her hands were clean, but she could still feel the memory of the blood on them, which was a thing that didn't go away with soap, and she had long ago stopped expecting it to. "This afternoon," she said. "Give me 2 hours." Sorrel nodded, stood, stopped at the doorway, turned back with the expression of a man who had something to say that did not fit neatly into the operational framework of everything else they had discussed. "For what it's worth," he said, "the call you made on the North Shore, going back instead of boarding." He stopped, seemed to be deciding how much precision to use. "If you'd been on that boat, we wouldn't have known about the transponder until after Reeves' people had already been briefed on its contents. The response time on the other end would have been—" He stopped again. "The case would have looked different." Rachel looked at him. "I went back because the dog was telling me to," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." He left. She sat with her coffee until it was fully cold, which took less time than she'd expected. The debrief with Calloway's office lasted 4 hours and was conducted in a conference room with 3 federal agents, a stenographer, and a recording device that Rachel had been asked to acknowledge on the record at the start of the session. She answered every question she was asked, in the order she was asked it, without editorializing and without softening any of the edges of what had happened. She described Ridgeline's behavior in the ER. She described the identification tag and the coordinates. She described the name Miriam Voss and the pause she had held internally when she heard it. She described the transponder in the cache. She described, in precise language, handing Dalton Reeves' authorization code to a federal agent on a boat in the middle of a storm, and watching the agent go very still. At the end of the session, Calloway walked her to the conference room door and said, in the quiet matter-of-fact tone of a person who had spent her career translating these things into something sayable, "You did the right things, in the right order, under the wrong conditions. That matters." "The dog did most of the navigating," Rachel said. Calloway looked at her steadily. "Take the credit," she said. "It's yours." Rachel drove home at 7 in the evening. She sat in her car in the parking lot of her apartment building for approximately 3 minutes before going in, which was a thing she sometimes needed to do. The pause between the version of herself that functioned in the operational space and the version that ate dinner and slept. The pause where the 2 versions of herself negotiated the handoff. She thought about Voss being walked out of his own hospital in handcuffs. She thought about Drake in a surgical suite somewhere, a 3-year-old injury finally being addressed by someone who had the right equipment and the time. She thought about Ridgeline and where Ridgeline was, and whether he was with Drake, and whether Drake had been told yet that the dog had not been classified as a loss. That someone in the K-9 unit administration had simply filed the paperwork incorrectly and the error had been compounded by a classified operation going dark, and that Ridgeline was, in the official record, still an active military working dog. She had found that out from Sorrel, who had found it out from the K-9 unit liaison who had come in from the Portland command, and who had said, in the voice of a person confronting an institutional error of extraordinary duration, that the situation would be corrected immediately. She was still sitting in her car when her phone rang. Unknown number, federal prefix. She picked up. "Ms. Hayes," Calloway's voice, compact and direct. "I need you to be aware of something before you see the morning news." Rachel's hand tightened on the phone. "What happened?" "Reeve made a statement through his attorney this evening. He's disputing the chain of evidence, specifically a beat. The specific beat of a person selecting words. He's disputing the integrity of the drive. His attorney is claiming that a civilian with no federal standing had unsanctioned access to military evidence for a period of approximately 4 hours before it entered official federal custody, and that this represents a contamination issue." The silence on Rachel's end lasted about 3 seconds. "That's not a legal theory," she said. "That's a delay tactic." "It's both," Calloway said. "The contamination argument doesn't have merit. Your handling of the drive is documented, time-stamped, and consistent with an exigent circumstances exception. Drake authorized the transfer directly, and his authority to do so as the originating officer of the record is sound. She paused. But Reeves' legal team has petitioned for an emergency hearing tomorrow morning to challenge the drive's admissibility. Federal Judge, 8 a.m. Rachel processed this. The specific shape of what was happening, not a real challenge to the evidence, but a procedural one. A calculated attempt to create enough ambiguity around the one piece of evidence that connected every element of Drake's 3-year documentation into a legally coherent case. The drive she had carried in her pocket across an island in a storm and 4 hours of a hospital debriefing. "They're going after me," she said, specifically. "You were always going to be the vulnerability they aimed at," Calloway said. "You're a civilian. You're a nurse. You countermanded a physician's orders 11 days ago and were put on administrative leave by a man who is now facing federal charges, which creates a narrative they'll try to use." She paused. "I want you to understand what you're walking into tomorrow morning. The federal hearing is not the trial. The evidence is strong, but they are going to put you in a room and try to make the story about you." Rachel looked at the parking lot, the wet pavement reflecting a single light pole, the rest of the lot in the gray early dark of a November evening on the Oregon coast. She thought about Voss's office 3 days ago, which felt like it belonged to a different year. "You're a talented nurse, Rachel. Nobody disputes that." "What time do you need me there?" she said. A pause that was almost, not quite, the pause of a woman who did not often hear that particular combination of steadiness and clarity and was registering it. 7:45, Calloway said. "Federal building on 3rd. Bring your hospital ID and whatever documentation you have regarding your Army service." "I'll be there," Rachel said. She ended the call. Sat for another moment. The parking lot was quiet. The storm was entirely gone now, the sky clearing to the particular sharp black of a Pacific Coast night after rain. The stars doing the thing they do when the clouds leave, and you remember they were always there. She thought about the hearing, about a room that would try to make the story about her, about a nurse who had overstepped, who had handled evidence she had no standing to handle, who was technically unqualified for everything she had done in the last 30 hours. A room that would try to make her the smallest version of herself, the version that fit the narrative Reeves' lawyers needed her to fit. She thought about everything that had happened in the last 30 hours, and who she had been through all of it, and how none of it had required anyone's permission, and how the results of it were sitting in a federal evidence file with Drake's name on 3 years of meticulous documentation, and how 4 people were alive in a hospital tonight who had been on an island this morning. She thought about Ridgeline walking through the automatic doors in the middle of the storm and the way he had looked at the room and found her, out of everyone in it, without hesitation. Then she got out of the car and went inside because she had a deposition to prepare for and approximately 7 hours to sleep, and in the morning she was going to walk into a federal hearing and be exactly who she was. And if that was not enough for the room, then the room was going to have to adjust. The drive was already in federal custody. The testimony was already on record. The evidence chain was already established by people who had documented it with more care than she'd had time to appreciate in real time. But Reeves' legal team didn't know one thing. One specific thing that Calloway hadn't mentioned yet, possibly because she was still verifying it, possibly because she was waiting for the right moment. Miriam Voss had given her full statement that afternoon. And in that statement, she had named 2 members of the original review board that had suppressed her initial report 4 years ago. The report that should have begun this investigation before an island and a storm and a dog were ever necessary. One of those names was the federal judge assigned to tomorrow morning's hearing. Calloway found out about the judge at 11:47 that night. Rachel knew this because her phone lit up with a text that said only, "Hearing reassigned. New judge appointed 600. Stand by. No explanation, no elaboration." The specific brevity of a person who was still working at midnight and did not have time for full sentences. Rachel put the phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a while, processing the specific shape of what that meant. The judge whose name appeared in Miriam's statement had presumably been contacted by Calloway's office, by the court's own conflict review, by some institutional mechanism that moved faster than Rachel had expected it to, and then removed from the case. Quietly. With the kind of speed that meant someone had understood exactly what his presence in that hearing room would have meant for the integrity of everything built over the last 30 hours. She slept 4 hours. It was not enough, and it was what she had. The federal building on 3rd was the kind of architecture that expressed authority through blankness. Wide stone steps, double glass doors, the interior hum of a building that had been processing human consequence for decades and had long since stopped being moved by any individual instance of it. Rachel arrived at 7:42. She had dressed in the way she dressed for difficult things. Not formally, not with performance, just cleanly. The way you'd dress if you wanted the room to see the person and not the costume. Calloway met her in the lobby. She looked like someone who had also slept approximately 4 hours and had decided that was sufficient. "New judge is Hargrove," she said. "District level. He's been on the federal bench 11 years and has no known connection to Reeves' network or the regional command." She handed Rachel a folder. "This is the evidence chain documentation for the drive. Your name, timestamp, and Drake's authorization. Reeves' attorneys will argue the authorization wasn't valid. Hargrove will disagree." "How do you know?" Rachel said. "Because we had 3 separate legal opinions by 0400, Calloway said, and they all say the same thing. Drake was the originating officer of the record. He had standing to designate a recipient. The exigent circumstances on that island were documented by 6 federal witnesses." She paused. "Reeves' team is going to stand up in that room and try to make you seem like an unauthorized civilian who contaminated military evidence. And then I'm going to stand up and explain that without that civilian, the evidence wouldn't exist in any form that a court could reach." The hearing lasted 90 minutes. Rachel sat in the gallery for most of it, called to the stand for 22 minutes in the middle, during which she answered questions in the same precise and unornamented way she had answered the debrief questions the day before. Reeves' attorney was skilled and well-prepared and tried 3 different angles in the time allotted, and none of them found purchase because the facts were not cooperative, and Rachel did not give him anything to work with beyond the facts. Judge Hargrove denied the motion to suppress. His language in the ruling was not elaborate. The drive was admissible. The chain of custody was sound. The civilian designation of the person who had transported the evidence was not a vulnerability in the chain. It was, under the specific circumstances, the chain. Reeves' attorney asked for an immediate appeal. Hargrove noted the request and moved on. Rachel walked out of the federal building into November sunshine, the post-storm kind, sharp and cold and provisional, and stood on the steps for a moment. Nothing felt the way it was supposed to feel after a thing like that. It felt smaller and larger simultaneously, which was the honest experience of institutional validation. It mattered, and it was also just a ruling in a room, and both of those things were true, and neither canceled the other. Her phone rang. Drake. She answered. "Hargrove denied it," she said. "I know." His voice was different from the island version of it. Still careful, still deliberate, but with some quality that the island voice had lacked. The quality of a man who had slept in a real bed for the first time in 3 years and had a functioning arm for the first time in 18 months, and was, incrementally, re-entering a world that had continued without him. "Calloway called me at 9. I wanted to say thank you before the day got complicated." "The dog did the work," Rachel said. "Stop doing that," he said, not harshly, with the slight impatience of a person who had been listening to her deflect for 36 hours. "Ridgeline chose you because you were the right person. That's not a compliment to the dog. It's a fact about you." She was quiet for a moment. The steps were cold under her shoes, and the city was doing its morning business around her with complete indifference. "How's the arm?" she said. "They tell me 6 weeks of physical therapy and I'll have about 80% back, which is more than I've had in a year and a half, so..." A pause. "He's here, by the way. They brought him this morning. The K9 liaison came with the paperwork." Another pause, longer. "He's lying on the foot of the bed and pretending he's not watching me." Rachel pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose for a moment. Not sadness. The other thing. The complicated thing that didn't have a single clean name. "Good," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Good." The trial of Dalton Reeve lasted 3 weeks and was not something Rachel attended beyond her formal testimony, which she gave on the second day with the same precision she had brought to everything else. Reeves' defense attempted 4 separate strategies in sequence, abandoning each as the evidence absorbed them. The authorization codes held. The transport logs held. The communication intercepts held. Miriam Voss testified for 6 hours across 2 days, and her testimony held. And the 2 contractors who had been on the island added theirs. And the logistics specialist with 3 aliases who had decided early that cooperation was in his interest provided detailed confirmation of the network structure going back to its origin. The judge assigned to sentencing was not a gentle person about it. Dalton Reeve received 22 years on 7 counts, including 3 counts of conspiracy resulting in death, 2 counts of trafficking facilitation, 1 count of falsification of military records, and 1 count of procurement fraud with national security implications. His attorney filed an appeal the same afternoon. The appeal was denied 4 months later. Harlan Voss tried separately on lesser charges appropriate to his lower position in the network: money laundering through fraudulent medical supply invoices, accessory to the suppression of Miriam's original report, received 6 years and permanent revocation of his hospital administrative license. The Redwood Memorial Board removed his name from the building's administrative directory within the week, which was the kind of small institutional action that carried a weight disproportionate to its size. The review board member named in Miriam's statement, the one who had sat on the panel that buried her original report 4 years ago, resigned from the federal bench before formal charges were filed, and subsequently faced a separate civil proceeding that resulted in a financial settlement, whose terms were not made public, but which were described by people familiar with them as significant. The 2 other officials within the Pacific Regional Command structure who had maintained strategic blindness in exchange for access were formally censured, stripped of security clearances, and administratively separated from service. Their cases were referred to the Department of Justice for further investigation. 14 transport operations were traced, documented, and prosecuted. Every individual identified as a participant in the network's logistics chain faced charges proportional to their involvement. The process was not fast, and it was not clean, and it did not end at a single moment that felt like a door closing. It was the long, imperfect, grinding work of institutional consequence, which looked nothing like justice does in the stories people tell about justice, and which was, despite that, justice. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Redwood Memorial hosted a recognition event that the hospital board carefully did not call a ceremony because a ceremony would have required the kind of institutional self-congratulation that the people involved had not earned and did not deserve. They called it an acknowledgement, which was more accurate. It was held in the main conference room on a Tuesday afternoon. 40 people, roughly, hospital staff, several federal agents, including Calloway and Dre, Sorrell in his uniform, the 2 soldiers who had been on the island and were back in service with desk assignments while their respective injuries finished healing, Aldert, who had driven up from the South Coast for the occasion, Miriam, who sat in the 3rd row and did not cry and was clearly working very hard at not crying. Drake came last, which was not planned. He had been running late because of a physical therapy appointment that ran over, and he came in through the side door while someone else was already speaking, and Ridgeline was with him on a leash, which was a formality neither of them seemed entirely comfortable with. And when Ridgeline came through the door, he stopped, assessed the room, and then led Drake directly to the empty seat next to Rachel, with the uncomplicated certainty of an animal who had done more complicated navigation than this, and found the process unworthy of his full attention. Drake sat, looked at Rachel sideways. "Sorry," he said. "Shoulder." "You're 40 minutes late," she said. 42. He settled into the chair. The PT is very thorough and has no concept of external scheduling constraints. Ridgeline put his head on Rachel's knee without asking and looked at the speaker at the front of the room. Rachel put her hand on the dog's head and left it there. Calloway spoke briefly, which was her way with everything. She described the investigation in the compressed, facts-first language of someone who understood that naming a thing precisely was more powerful than dramatizing it. She named the people who had been recovered from the island. She named the charges that had resulted in convictions. She named Drake and acknowledged, in the specific language of a federal investigator who chose her words with the care of someone who knew their weight, that he had maintained an active intelligence operation under extreme duress for 3 years, and that the evidence he compiled had been the structural foundation of every successful prosecution that followed. Then she said, "The operation was located and set in motion by a nurse who recognized a military working dog's distress signals in an emergency room at midnight during a coastal storm. Every chain of events that followed began with that recognition. We would like to formally acknowledge Rachel Hayes. The room did the thing rooms do when they've been waiting for a name. Rachel had given testimony. She had sat in a federal hearing. She had dressed wounds on a moving boat in the dark. None of those things had felt like this. Not because this was more important, but because this was witnessed, and witnessing does something to a thing that privacy cannot. She was not a person who stood easily under that kind of attention. She had spent most of her professional life in the background of outcomes, which was where nurses generally lived, the people who kept the machinery of the before and after running while the credited moment happened in the middle. She had not minded that. She had genuinely not minded it. But she stood, and she looked at the room, at Miriam in the third row, who was losing the battle against crying, at Sorrel, who had straightened in his chair and had the expression of a man revising something, at the two young soldiers who had been on an island floor for 8 days and were now in dress uniforms that fit them correctly. And she felt the weight of what it meant to be seen accurately by people who understood what had actually happened. She didn't speak for long. That was not who she was, and this was not the moment to become someone else for the sake of the occasion. "I didn't go to the island because I was brave," she said. "I went because the dog told me to, and I had enough background to understand what he was saying. Everything that came after that was just the same thing, paying attention to what was in front of me and doing the thing that the situation required." She paused. "That's nursing. That's also being a soldier. It turns out they're the same skill in a lot of the situations that matter." She stopped. Then, because it was true and because the room deserved the truth of it, the people on that island survived because one person refused for 3 years to accept that being abandoned meant it was over. That's the thing worth recognizing. I just carried the record home. Drake, beside her, said nothing, but his jaw moved briefly in the way of a person absorbing something that arrived closer to center than they had braced for. Afterward, in the parking lot, in the specific quiet of a thing that has concluded, Rachel stood with Ridgeline while Drake talked to Calloway near the building's entrance. The dog sat at her feet and watched the parking lot with the patient vigilance that was simply his nature. Not anxious, not aggressive, just present. Doing the job of being attentive to the world because that was the job and he understood the job. She thought about the night he had walked through the hospital doors, the storm, the way the room had gone still, the way he had looked at her across a waiting room full of people who were, by every measurable criterion, more qualified to receive whatever he was carrying, and had walked to her anyway. She did not know what she believed about why that happened. She had some working theories, and none of them were fully satisfying, which seemed right. The fully satisfying explanation for a thing like that would probably be the wrong one. What she knew was that she had been dismissed from her job on a Tuesday and been living on the island of her own competence, waiting for someone to recognize the solid ground of it. And then the ground had revealed itself to be connected to something larger, and she had followed that connection through a storm and into the dark and back out the other side. And she was standing here now with her reinstated hospital ID in her pocket and a federal commendation that she still hadn't decided where to put. Drake came back from the building, stood beside her. Ridgeline leaned briefly against his leg and then sat back down between them, equidistant, which she suspected was a deliberate choice on the dog's part and chose not to examine too carefully. "What happens now?" she said. Not to Drake specifically, a general question to the air. "For me?" He looked at the parking lot. "Medical board review, back pay determination, the formal reinstatement process, which apparently involves a significant amount of paperwork." He said paperwork with the tone of a man who had spent 3 years on an island and had expected re-entry into civilian bureaucracy to be the easy part. And then, "I don't know yet, something that isn't alone." "That's a reasonable place to start," she said. "For you?" he said. She thought about her shift tomorrow. The ER at 7 a.m., the morning chart review, the specific rhythm of a hospital floor that didn't stop for anything, including the nights that changed everything. Dolores would already be there. The chest pain in Bay 2 would have been replaced by a different chest pain or a fracture. or the child behind curtain 4 who was always crying in a different voice, but always a child, always someone's most important person needing the thing that only careful attention could provide. Back to work, she said. Same job, different context. Drake glanced at her. The context matters. It always did, she said. Some rooms just take longer to figure that out than others. Ridgeline stood. He did the thing he did, looking at one of them, then the other, then at the direction of whatever came next. Not commanding, not demanding, just indicating. The quiet signal of an animal who had carried something enormous across an impossible distance and delivered it, and was now simply still present, still paying attention, still doing the work. Some people move through the world loudly, demanding to be recognized before they've done anything worth recognizing. And some people carry the weight in silence, do the impossible thing in the dark, and let the results speak with the authority that only results have. Rachel Hayes had never needed a room to see her to know what she was worth, but she was learning, in the parking lot on a cold Tuesday in November, that letting the room see her was not the same as needing it, that being recognized could be received without being depended on, that the long, quiet work of being competent and present and paying attention, done without applause in the background of other people's credited moments, had not been wasted just because no one was counting it at the time. It was always there. It had always been enough. The world had just needed a storm and a dog and a midnight door opening to finally look at what had been standing there all along. She reached down and scratched Ridgeline behind the ears. He leaned into it with the uncomplicated honesty of an animal who knew what it had done and needed nothing more from the acknowledgement than the warmth of a hand that understood. "Come on," she said, to both of them, to neither of them, to whatever came after the ending of a thing that had tried very hard to stay buried. She walked to her car. Behind her, she heard Drake follow, heard Ridgeline's quiet footfall on the cold pavement, steady and certain. The work was not finished. Work like this was never entirely finished. But the part that had needed her specifically in this specific form was done, and she had been there for it, and she had been enough, and that was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing.